The millionaire husband hid his wife at the party in his luxury mansion in front of everyone. "You're worthless, you don't deserve to be by my side," he shouted at her. But something happened that left everyone speechless. Anthony Fletcher's mansion gleamed like a jewel in the night. The massive estate, adorned with extravagant chandeliers and golden decor, stood as a testament to his power and wealth. Tonight, it wasn't just a party, it was a statement. He had gathered some of the most powerful people in the country, CEOs, politicians, and socialites, all eager to bask in the glow of his success. This was the evening he'd celebrate signing one of the most lucrative contracts of his career, solidifying his reputation as a titan of industry. The air buzzed with the sound of champagne glasses clinking and muffled conversations as waiters in crisp black uniforms weaved through the crowd. Jessica, Anthony's wife, quietly entered the main hall. She wore a simple yet elegant navy blue dress, one she'd chosen herself, a stark contrast to the shimmering designer gowns of the other women. Her natural beauty shone through, but it was clear she didn't belong to this world of excess. Guests eyed her with subtle disdain, murmuring as she passed by. Jessica was used to it. Over the years, she'd grown accustomed to the whispers and judgment. They called her the charity case, a woman who was never enough for Anthony Fletcher's towering ambitions. But tonight, she smiled softly, determined not to let their opinions get under her skin. Anthony stood near the grand staircase, surrounded by a cluster of influential men who hung on his every word. He radiated confidence, dressed in a sharp black suit that made him look every bit the powerful mogul he was. But beneath the polished exterior, his patience was wearing thin. His day had been riddled with setbacks. Negotiations almost fell apart. An unexpected stock dip threatened his portfolio, and now even the celebration felt like a chore. He checked his watch, suppressing a sigh as he spotted Jessica approaching. "Anthony," Jessica greeted him softly, her voice drowned out by the chatter. He turned to her, offering a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. She could sense his mood but chose to focus on making him proud tonight. As the night unfolded, she floated among the guests, doing her best to engage politely while staying out of the spotlight. It was during one of these moments, while trying to maneuver through the crowded hall with a glass of wine, that the evening took a sudden turn. Jessica, distracted by someone brushing past her, accidentally tipped her glass. The dark red wine spilled onto Anthony's pristine white suit jacket, drawing audible gasps from those nearby. The chatter around them stopped as if someone had hit mute on the room. Anthony froze, his jaw clenched, and his piercing gaze locked onto Jessica, who was already fumbling to apologize. "Anthony, I'm so sorry," she began, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but Anthony's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Jessica," he said, his tone low and venomous, "do you even understand what you've done?" The humiliation boiling inside him was unbearable. People were staring, some trying to stifle their smirks. This wasn't just a stain on his jacket. It was a stain on his carefully crafted image. Jessica reached for a napkin, desperate to clean the mess, but Anthony's patience snapped. His voice rose sharp and unforgiving. "You're worthless," he spat, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You don't deserve to be by my side." The room collectively held its breath. Jessica froze, her hand trembling as she dropped the napkin. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but she refused to let them fall. For a moment she stood there, vulnerable and exposed, while the weight of his words crashed over her. Then, without warning, Anthony pushed her away. Jessica stumbled, landing on the floor in front of the stunned crowd. Gasps echoed through the hall. Some guests exchanged awkward glances. Others turned away, pretending not to notice. No one dared to intervene. Anthony adjusted his tie, barely sparing her another glance as he muttered, "Clean yourself up." Before turning back toward his guests, Jessica remained on the floor for a moment, her mind reeling. She felt the heat of humiliation burn her cheeks as she slowly picked herself up. The room still buzzed with tension, but she straightened her back and walked away from the scene with as much grace as she could muster. Behind her, the party resumed, albeit with an undercurrent of unease. Guests whispered about the outburst, speculating on what it might mean, but Anthony, ever the master of appearances, dismissed their concerns with a casual laugh and a toast to his recent success. For Jessica, however, something shifted in that moment. The humiliation and pain weren't new, but tonight they cut deeper as she retreated to a quieter part of the house. She couldn't shake the thought that this life, this constant struggle to appease Anthony's ego, was no longer worth it. She wiped a stray tear from her cheek and whispered to herself, "Not anymore." Jessica sat in the quiet of the guest room, her heart pounding as the echoes of Anthony's words replayed in her mind. "You're worthless. You don't deserve to be by my side." She stared at her reflection in the ornate mirror that hung on the wall. Her hands trembled as she smoothed the fabric of her dress. Trying to steady herself, the elegant navy blue gown that she had chosen with such care now felt like a disguise, a costume she'd worn to a life she no longer recognized as her own. The muffled sounds of the party carried through the mansion's walls, laughter, clinking glasses, and the murmur of conversations that resumed as if nothing had happened. Jessica knew the whispers would come next. By tomorrow, the story of how Anthony Fletcher humiliated his wife in front of the city's elite would spread like wildfire. She imagined the headlines, "The Queen of Luxury crumbles under pressure," or worse, "Jessica Fletcher, a misstep from the start." Her chest tightened at the thought, but another feeling began to stir deep within her. Anger. Not the sharp, impulsive anger she'd seen in Anthony so many times, but a quiet, simmering rage born from years of humiliation, sacrifice, and neglect. How had she let it come to this? How had she given so much of herself to a man who couldn't even show her basic respect? Downstairs, Anthony was back in the spotlight, already commanding the room with a toast. His suit jacket was gone, replaced by a spare one from his closet, but his arrogance remained fully intact. "To success," he declared, his voice booming as he raised a crystal glass. "To power, and to those who know how to rise above small mistakes." The crowd responded with polite applause. Though many exchanged knowing glances, the tension from earlier still lingered, a faint crack in the carefully polished surface of Anthony's image. But Anthony, oblivious or perhaps indifferent, basked in the attention, confident that his power would silence any whispers. Jessica, meanwhile, stood from the small chaise in the guest room. She couldn't sit in the shadows any longer. With steady hands, she wiped the corners of her eyes and smoothed her hair. If she was going to face the crowd again, she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. She made her way back down the grand staircase, her steps measured and deliberate. Guests turned to look as she entered the room. Conversations hushed, replaced by stolen glances and murmured remarks. Jessica felt the weight of their stares, but she held her head high. Anthony noticed her entrance and raised an eyebrow. "Decided to join us again?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Jessica met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, I did." Her voice was calm but firm, carrying a weight that made Anthony falter for just a moment. She walked past him, weaving through the crowd with grace. A few guests offered awkward smiles, unsure of how to react, while others looked away, unwilling to acknowledge the tension. Jessica didn't care. She wasn't walking for them. She made her way to the far side of the room, where a small group of servers was stationed, refilling drinks and clearing plates. One of them, a young woman named Emily, caught her eye. Jessica had spoken to Emily before the party started, complimenting her on how well she managed the chaos of such a large event. "Mrs. Fletcher," Emily said quietly, her voice laced with concern. "Are you okay?" Jessica smiled faintly. "I'll be fine, Emily. Thank you." Her words were meant to reassure, but they felt hollow even to her. Suddenly, the grand double doors of the mansion creaked open. Drawing the attention of everyone in the room, the butler, who had been stationed at the entrance, stepped aside as an older man in modest clothing entered. He walked with a quiet confidence, his back straight and his eyes sharp. In his hands, he held a weathered envelope. "Anthony Fletcher," the man called out, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "It's time to reveal who you really are." The room fell silent. Anthony turned slowly, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice laced with irritation. The man stepped further into the room, ignoring the stares from the crowd. "My name is Frank Collins," he said, his tone steady. "And I worked for you once, a long time ago, until you ruined my life." A ripple of whispers spread through the room as Frank's words sank in. Anthony's eyes narrowed and his jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said dismissively. "Oh, but you do," Frank replied. He held up the envelope for all to see. "I have the proof, Anthony. Proof of everything you've done." The lies, the corruption, the people you stepped on to build your empire, and I'm here to make sure everyone knows the truth." Jessica's heart raced as she watched the scene unfold. She barely knew this man, but his presence felt like a lifeline, a crack of light in the suffocating darkness of her marriage. Anthony laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "This is ridiculous," he said, addressing the crowd. "This man is clearly delusional, probably looking for a payout." Frank didn't flinch. "You can deny it all you want, Fletcher, but the truth has a way of catching up to men like you. And tonight, in front of all these people, your empire begins to crumble." The weight of Frank's words hung in the air as the room held its collective breath. For the first time that night, Anthony Fletcher looked truly vulnerable. Jessica, standing at the edge of the crowd, felt something shift inside her. This was the beginning of the end, not just for Anthony, but for the woman she'd been under his shadow. The tension in the room was palpable. Frank Collins stood tall at the center of the grand hall, his modest attire a stark contrast to the lavish surroundings. His presence felt like an earthquake shaking the very foundation of Anthony Fletcher's carefully constructed empire. Guests who had been sipping champagne just moments ago now exchanged anxious glances. Torn between their curiosity and their loyalty to their powerful host, Jessica remained near the edge of the crowd. Her heart pounding. For years, she had watched Anthony navigate the world with arrogance and unchecked power, believing he was untouchable. But now, here was this man, Frank, claiming to hold the truth that could bring it all crashing down. She couldn't decide if she felt relief or dread. Anthony's voice broke the silence, sharp and commanding. "All right, Frank, you've had your moment of theatrics. Now leave my home before I have you thrown out." His tone carried the confidence of someone used to having the final word, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Frank didn't budge. Instead, he opened the envelope he had been clutching and pulled out several sheets of paper. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "Not until I've shown everyone here the kind of man you really are." Anthony's smile faltered. "This is absurd. Whatever you think you have, it's meaningless." Frank stepped closer, holding up the first document. "Is it? Let's start with this, shall we? A contract from 10 years ago. Do you remember Fletcher Steelworks, Anthony? The factory you opened in the Midwest? The one that mysteriously shut down 6 months later, leaving hundreds of workers without jobs?" Anthony's expression hardened. "That's ancient history. It has nothing to do with tonight." Frank's voice rose, carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "It has everything to do with tonight, because this contract proves that you intentionally bankrupted that factory after siphoning millions of dollars into your offshore accounts. You didn't just ruin lives, Anthony. You stole from the very people who trusted you." Gasps erupted from the guests, and the murmurs grew louder. Anthony's face turned red, and he took a step forward, his finger pointing at Frank. "You're lying. That's fake." Frank didn't flinch. He reached into his envelope again and pulled out another document. "Oh, but it doesn't stop there. How about this one? Proof that you forged signatures to secure a government contract for your construction company." Does that sound familiar? Jessica's breath caught. She had heard whispers of shady deals over the years, but had never dared to question Anthony directly. Now, hearing these accusations laid out so boldly, she felt a mix of shock and vindication. Anthony turned to the crowd, his voice loud and defensive. "This man is a disgruntled ex-employee trying to smear my name. He's bitter and looking for attention." He laughed, but it sounded forced. "You all know me. You know my success isn't built on lies." The crowd didn't seem so sure anymore. Conversations buzzed around the room, and more than a few people looked skeptical. Anthony's charm and bravado, which had always been his armor, were beginning to crack. Frank's gaze shifted toward Jessica, his expression softening. "And then there's your wife, Anthony. Jessica, the woman who gave up everything for you." Jessica froze as every eye in the room turned toward her. Anthony's jaw tightened, and he barked, "Leave her out of this." But Frank pressed on. "Do they know, Anthony? Do these people know how you begged her for help when your first company was failing? How she sold off her family's assets to save your dreams? Or how you've repaid her kindness with humiliation and control?" Jessica felt a lump rise in her throat. She had spent so many years trying to forget those early days, convincing herself that her sacrifices had been worth it. Now, hearing them spoken aloud, she wasn't sure whether to feel exposed or empowered. Anthony glared at her. his voice low and venomous. "Don't listen to him. He's just trying to turn you against me." But something had shifted inside Jessica. For years, she had believed that her silence was a form of loyalty, that enduring Anthony's temper and arrogance was her duty as his wife. Now, she wasn't so sure. The weight of Frank's words settled over her, and she realized that the truth was no longer something she could ignore. Frank continued, his tone steady and unrelenting. "You've spent years hiding behind your money and your status, Anthony, but the truth has a way of coming out. And tonight, in front of all these people, your lies are finally catching up to you." The room fell silent again, the weight of Frank's accusations hanging heavy in the air. Anthony looked around, his confident facade beginning to crumble. For the first time in years, he looked vulnerable. Jessica stepped forward, her voice calm but filled with resolve. "Is it true, Anthony?" she asked, her eyes locked on his. "Did you take everything I gave you and use it to lie and cheat your way to the top?" Anthony's lips pressed into a thin line. "Jessica, don't do this. Not here, not now." But Jessica didn't back down. "Why not? Because these people might finally see who you really are." Her words cut through the air like a knife. Anthony looked around, searching for an ally, but the crowd had turned. The murmurs grew louder, and the once reverent atmosphere of the party now felt like a trial. Frank turned to Jessica, his voice gentle. "You've been through enough, Jessica. It's time to stop protecting him." Jessica nodded slowly, the anger and pain she had suppressed for so long finally bubbling to the surface. "You're right," she said. "It's time." Anthony's face twisted with rage, but for the first time, he seemed powerless to stop what was unfolding. The crowd watched, transfixed, as the empire of Anthony Fletcher began to crack under the weight of its own lies. The silence in the room was deafening, save for the low murmur of uneasy whispers as the weight of Frank Collins' accusations sank in. Anthony stood frozen at the center of the room, his carefully curated image unraveling before the very people he had worked so hard to impress. Jessica, standing just a few steps away, could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The air was heavy with tension, but beneath it all, she sensed something else. Doubt. Doubt in Anthony, doubt in his empire, and doubt in the lies he had spun for years. Frank's voice broke the tension, clear and resolute. "Anthony Fletcher," he began, his tone deliberate. "For years, you've hidden behind your wealth and your connections, acting as if you were untouchable. But tonight, the truth comes out. You built your fortune on the backs of hardworking people, and you've left a trail of destruction in your wake." Anthony scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "This is ridiculous. These baseless accusations mean nothing. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" He gestured broadly to the crowd, trying to regain control. "These people know me. They know the kind of man I am." But the murmurs didn't stop. Instead, they grew louder, and the skepticism in the room became palpable. Anthony's eyes darted around, scanning for familiar faces, friends, allies, anyone who might come to his defense. But those he once counted on for support now seemed to shrink into the background, unwilling to align themselves with a man whose reputation was rapidly disintegrating. Jessica's voice, steady but laced with pain, cut through the noise. "Do they really know you, Anthony?" All eyes turned to her. "Because I'm starting to realize that I never did." Anthony glared at her, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. "Jessica, this is not the time." She didn't let him finish. "No, Anthony, this is exactly the time. For years, I stood by your side, defending you, believing in you, even when everything in me told me something was wrong. I sacrificed everything, my family, my fortune, my peace of mind, all because I believed in the man you said you were. And now I find out that everything I gave was just fuel for your lies." The room fell silent again, her words landing like a blow. Anthony opened his mouth to respond, but Frank stepped forward, cutting him off. "She's not wrong, Anthony. She gave you everything, and you used her, just like you used me and everyone else who trusted you." Frank reached into his envelope once more, pulling out another document. "Here's a list of names. People you cheated, manipulated, and discarded, workers, partners, friends, and Jessica. She's just the most recent on a long list of people who deserved better." Anthony's composure was slipping, the cracks in his facade widening. "This is a setup," he said, his voice rising. You think you can just waltz in here and tear me down? You're nothing, Frank. You've always been nothing. Frank smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. Maybe I was nothing to you, Anthony, but tonight, I'm the one holding the truth, and you can't talk your way out of this. A ripple of movement caught Jessica's attention. Several guests were inching closer, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. Among them was a journalist from a prominent publication, her notebook already in hand. She leaned toward Frank, her pen poised. "Mr. Collins," she began, her voice steady but urgent. "Are you saying you have evidence of corruption and fraud?" Anthony's head snapped toward her. "This is a private event," he snapped. "You have no right to—" "Actually," Frank interjected, his tone calm but firm. "She does, because the truth shouldn't be hidden behind the walls of your mansion, Anthony. It belongs out there, where everyone can see it." The journalist turned to Jessica. "Mrs. Fletcher, would you care to comment on what's happening here tonight?" Jessica hesitated, her eyes flickering to Anthony. For years, she had played the role of the silent, supportive wife, the woman who stood by her husband no matter what. But tonight, something inside her had shifted. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into this party hours ago. She took a deep breath, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I think it's time people knew the truth about the man Anthony Fletcher really is." Anthony's face darkened, and he took a step toward her. "Jessica, stop this right now." But she didn't flinch. "Or what, Anthony? You'll humiliate me again? Push me aside like you always do? I'm done being afraid of you." The crowd was riveted, their eyes bouncing between the two of them like spectators at a tennis match. Anthony's anger boiled over. "You have no idea what you're doing," he hissed. "You think you're better than me? You're nothing without me." Jessica met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "Maybe I was nothing to you, Anthony, but tonight, I'm finally something to myself." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, and for the first time, Jessica felt the power shift. Anthony, once so untouchable, now stood alone, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of his own lies. Frank stepped closer to him, his voice low but filled with conviction. "This is just the beginning, Anthony. The truth has a way of catching up, no matter how fast you run." Anthony turned away, his fists clenched. As the whispers around him grew louder, Jessica watched him retreat, her heart pounding. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe again. And as she stood there, surrounded by people who finally saw her for who she was, she realized that this wasn't just the beginning of Anthony's downfall. It was the beginning of her rise. The whispers in the grand hall reached a crescendo as Anthony stormed out of the center of the room, his pride visibly shattered. Jessica stood tall, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths as she processed the gravity of what had just transpired. For years, she had been silent, the dutiful wife in the background, playing her role in Anthony's theater of success. But now, for the first time, she felt the power of her own voice, and the way it reverberated through the crowd gave her strength. As Anthony retreated to the far side of the hall, Frank Collins stepped closer to Jessica, his demeanor calm but supportive. "You did well," he said quietly, his voice only loud enough for her to hear. "But there's more that needs to be said." Jessica turned to him, her gaze steady. "I've stayed quiet for too long. Frank, I'm done pretending everything is fine." Frank gave her a small nod of approval. "Then let's make sure the world hears the truth." The guests, still watching intently, parted slightly as Jessica moved toward the center of the room. Her heels clicked against the polished marble floor, each step deliberate and confident. She didn't know exactly what she was going to say, but she knew this moment mattered. Not just for her, but for every person who had been wronged by Anthony's lies. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jessica began, her voice carrying over the murmurs. The crowd quieted instantly, their eyes fixed on her. "I know many of you have questions about what you've seen and heard tonight. And while I wish this wasn't how things unfolded, I can't stay silent any longer." She paused, her hands trembling slightly, but she clenched them into fists to steady herself. "For years, I've stood by Anthony Fletcher, believing in his dreams, his vision, and his promises. I gave him everything I had. My trust, my support, and even my family's fortune, because I believed he was building something honest. I believed he was a man of integrity. But tonight, I see the truth." Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Some guests nodded subtly, while others exchanged uneasy glances in the corner of the room. Anthony paced like a caged animal, his fists clenched at his sides. Anthony Fletcher didn't just betray me, Jessica continued, her voice growing stronger. He betrayed the very people who helped him rise to power. He exploited workers, manipulated contracts, and destroyed lives, all in the name of his own ambition. And I stayed silent because I thought it was my duty to support him. I thought that was what love meant. She turned her gaze toward Anthony, who froze mid-step, his face a mix of fury and disbelief. But love isn't about silence. It's not about allowing someone to walk over others just because they can. Love is about honesty, respect, and accountability. And Anthony, you've shown me none of those things. The crowd was completely still now, their attention riveted on Jessica. She could feel their energy shifting, their skepticism giving way to sympathy and admiration for the first time in her life. She felt seen, not as Anthony Fletcher's wife, but as a person with her own voice, her own story. Frank stepped forward, holding up one of the documents he had pulled from his envelope earlier. Jessica isn't the only one who's been betrayed, he said, addressing the crowd. There are hundreds of others, workers, partners, friends, whose lives were torn apart by Anthony's greed. This is just the beginning. Anthony finally broke his silence, his voice a low growl. Enough of this. He marched toward the center of the room, his eyes blazing with anger. You think you can turn these people against me with your lies? I've built an empire, something none of you could ever dream of achieving, and you, he pointed a finger at Jessica. You owe everything you have to me. Jessica didn't flinch. Instead, she took a step closer to him, her voice calm but unwavering. You're wrong, Anthony. I don't owe you anything. In fact, it's you who owes me, and everyone in this room, the truth. Her words struck a nerve, and Anthony's composure crumbled further. You're just trying to humiliate me, he spat. You don't understand what it takes to succeed in this world. Jessica shook her head, a hint of sadness in her eyes. Maybe I don't understand your definition of success, Anthony, but I know that what you've done to get there isn't worth it. Not the lies, not the manipulation, and certainly not the way you've treated me and everyone else who ever believed in you. The crowd began to murmur again, their voices growing louder as they processed Jessica's words. Frank, sensing the momentum, raised his voice. The evidence is all here, he said, gesturing to the stack of documents in his hand. If anyone wants to see for themselves, I'll be happy to share, but let me tell you this. What Jessica just said is only the tip of the iceberg. Anthony looked around, his eyes darting from one guest to another, searching for any sign of support, but the faces staring back at him were no longer filled with admiration. They were filled with doubt, disappointment, and in some cases, outright disdain. Jessica took a deep breath, her heart racing as she prepared to deliver her final words. Anthony, you always told me that power made you untouchable. But tonight I realized something you never did. Real power doesn't come from money or status. It comes from truth, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what's right. And tonight I'm finally standing up for myself. The room erupted into applause. Not polite, obligatory applause, but genuine, thunderous applause that echoed through the mansion. Jessica felt tears prick her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of pain or humiliation. They were tears of release, of freedom. Anthony, now visibly shaken, turned on his heel and stalked out of the room, slamming the doors behind him. The sound reverberated through the hall. A final punctuation mark on the end of his reign over the evening, and perhaps over Jessica's life. Frank stepped beside Jessica, offering her a reassuring nod. This is just the beginning, he said. Jessica nodded, her voice steady. I know, and I'm ready. The mansion felt different now, as if the grandeur had been stripped away to reveal cracks in the walls. Both literal and metaphorical, the applause that had erupted moments ago had settled into a quieter hum of conversations. Some guests had already begun to leave, murmuring excuses about early mornings and pressing matters, though it was clear they wanted to distance themselves from the debacle unfolding within the Fletcher empire. Jessica stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the weight of what had just transpired. Her heart still raced, but a calm resolve steadied her. For the first time in years, she felt like she was breathing fresh air, unclouded by Anthony's oppressive shadow. Yet she couldn't deny the swirling chaos in her mind. What came next? Frank Collins was still at her side, shuffling through his stack of documents like a man ready to go into battle. The journalist who had been taking notes earlier approached cautiously, her pen still poised, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Mrs. Fletcher," the journalist began, her voice soft but probing. "Do you have any further comments on tonight's revelations? Surely this will have serious repercussions for your husband's business, and perhaps even for you." Jessica turned to her, feeling the weight of the question. "For years, I believed silence was the answer. I thought standing by my husband, no matter what, was my responsibility. But now I see that silence only enables people like Anthony to continue hurting others." She glanced at Frank, drawing strength from his presence. "So no, I have no intention of staying quiet anymore. The truth needs to come out." The journalist nodded, scribbling furiously. "And do you believe this will lead to legal action against Mr. Fletcher?" Jessica hesitated for a moment. Legal action. It hadn't even crossed her mind, yet, but she knew the answer was inevitable. "That's not for me to decide," she replied carefully. "But if it does, I won't stand in the way." Frank stepped forward, interjecting with his characteristic calm. "Legal action is only the beginning. The documents I've presented tonight are enough to launch investigations into several of Anthony's ventures. It's time for him to face the consequences of his actions." The journalist, clearly satisfied with the response, gave a polite nod and slipped away, no doubt eager to get the story published as quickly as possible. Jessica watched her leave, knowing that by morning, this scandal would be splashed across every major news outlet. The empire Anthony had spent decades building would begin to crumble brick by brick, under the weight of the truth. Jessica turned to Frank, her voice quieter now. "What happens next?" Frank's expression softened. "For Anthony, he'll scramble to do damage control. He'll deny everything, maybe even try to shift the blame. But the evidence is solid. He won't be able to bury this." "And for me?" Jessica asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Frank regarded her thoughtfully. "That depends on what you want, Jessica. Tonight, you took a stand. For yourself, for everyone he's hurt. But this fight isn't over. You'll have to decide how far you're willing to go." Jessica nodded, her mind racing. She had spent so long tethered to Anthony's world, his decisions, his lies. Now, standing on the precipice of freedom, she realized just how daunting the path ahead could be. But even so, she knew she couldn't turn back. Across the room, a few lingering guests cast wary glances at her, their polite smiles barely masking their unease. Jessica could see the calculations in their eyes, some weighing whether they should distance themselves from Anthony entirely, others perhaps considering how to leverage this scandal for their own gain. It was a stark reminder of the world Anthony had surrounded himself with, a world Jessica was no longer a part of. At that moment, the double doors at the far end of the room swung open. Anthony strode back in, his face a mask of fury and determination. His steps were quick and purposeful, his gaze locked on Jessica. The room fell silent once more, the remaining guests holding their breath. "Jessica," he called, his voice booming. "A word now." Frank stepped protectively closer to her, but Jessica raised a hand, stopping him. "It's fine," she said softly. "I'll handle this." Frank hesitated but nodded, staying close enough to intervene if needed. Jessica squared her shoulders and followed Anthony to a smaller private sitting room adjacent to the main hall. The tension between them was almost suffocating as Anthony slammed the door shut behind them. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his voice low but seething. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me tonight?" "To us?" Jessica met his glare without flinching. "I know exactly what I've done, Anthony. For the first time in years, I stood up for myself. I told the truth." Anthony scoffed, pacing like a predator in a cage. "The truth? The truth is you just handed my enemies the ammunition they've been waiting for. Do you think they care about you, about your little speech? They'll tear me apart, Jessica. They'll tear us apart." "There is no us, Anthony," Jessica said firmly. "Not anymore. You made sure of that long before tonight." Anthony stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "Don't do this. Don't act like you're innocent in all of this. You knew who I was when you married me." "I thought I knew," Jessica countered, her voice rising. "I thought you were someone who cared about more than money and power. I thought you were someone who cared about me." Anthony's expression flickered, just for a moment, with something that almost looked like regret, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. replaced by cold defiance. You think you're better than me now? That you can just walk away and leave me to deal with this mess? I don't think I'm better than you, Anthony, Jessica said quietly, but I know I deserve better. Anthony stared at her, his jaw tightening. For the first time, he seemed to realize that he couldn't intimidate her anymore. She wasn't the woman who had stood silently by his side for years. She was someone new, someone stronger. Without another word, Jessica turned and walked out of the room, leaving Anthony standing alone in the shadows of his own failure. As she stepped back into the grand hall, she felt the eyes of the remaining guests on her once more. But this time, she didn't care. She held her head high, ready to face whatever came next. The night outside the Fletcher mansion was eerily quiet, in stark contrast to the storm brewing within its gilded walls. Most of the guests had left, their departures hastened by the evening's chaos. The sprawling estate, once a symbol of opulence and control, now felt hollow, as though the truth that had spilled inside its walls had drained its grandeur. Jessica stood near the mansion's entrance, the cool night air brushing against her skin. She was still in the elegant dress she had chosen with care earlier that evening, but now it felt like a costume for a role she no longer wished to play. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to block out the lingering voices of doubt and fear in her mind. For years, she had been tethered to Anthony's world, to his lies, to his unchecked ambition. But tonight, she had cut those ties, or so she thought. Frank joined her outside, his footsteps crunching softly against the gravel. He carried the envelope that had been the centerpiece of the evening's drama, his grip firm as though it contained not just documents but the weight of years of betrayal and silence. "Are you all right?" Frank asked, his voice low and steady. Jessica nodded, though her expression betrayed her exhaustion. "I'm fine, or I will be." She glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "I just don't know what happens next." Frank leaned against the stone railing of the mansion's grand steps, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. "What happens next is up to you, Jessica. You've taken the first step. Speaking out, standing up for yourself. But this fight isn't over. Anthony won't go down without a fight, and neither will the people who've benefited from his lies." Jessica sighed, her breath visible in the chilly air. "I know. I feel like I've been sleepwalking through my life for so long, and now that I'm awake, I don't even recognize the world I'm standing in." Frank gave her a small, understanding smile. "That's normal, but you're stronger than you think, and you're not alone in this." Jessica looked at him, her expression softening. "Why are you doing this, Frank? You didn't have to come here tonight, to put yourself in the middle of this mess." Frank's jaw tightened, his gaze growing distant. "Because I've been where you are. I know what it feels like to be used, discarded, silenced. Anthony didn't just ruin my career. He took everything I'd worked for, everything I believed in, and I let him because I didn't think I had a choice. But now, seeing you stand up to him, it reminded me that we always have a choice." Jessica felt a pang of sadness for the man standing before her. He had risked so much to expose Anthony, to bring the truth to light, and yet, she knew his fight wasn't just about justice, it was about redemption. Before she could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind them. Jessica turned to see Anthony emerging from the mansion, his face set in a mask of fury. His tie was loosened, and his suit jacket hung over one arm, the picture of a man unraveling under the weight of his own downfall. "Jessica," he called, his voice sharp. "We need to talk." Frank straightened, stepping slightly in front of Jessica as if to shield her. "I think she said everything she needed to tonight," Frank said, his tone firm. Anthony glared at him, his voice laced with contempt. "Stay out of this, Collins. This is between me and my wife." Jessica stepped forward, her hand lightly brushing Frank's arm in a silent signal to let her handle it. "What do you want, Anthony?" she asked, her tone weary but resolute. Anthony's eyes flicked to Frank, then back to Jessica. "Alone," he said through gritted teeth. "I need to speak to you alone." Jessica hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but make it quick." Frank gave her a concerned look, but she met his gaze with a reassuring nod. "I'll be fine," she said quietly. Anthony led her a few steps away, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "What do you think you're doing?" "Jessica, do you have any idea what you've started tonight?" Jessica crossed her arms, meeting his glare with a steady gaze. "What I started, Anthony, is the truth. something you've been running from for years. Anthony's lips curled into a bitter smile. The truth. You think these people care about the truth? They care about power, about status, and you just handed them the ammunition they needed to destroy me. Jessica shook her head, her voice calm but firm. No, Anthony. You destroyed yourself. I just stopped covering for you. Anthony's expression darkened, and for a moment, Jessica saw a flicker of desperation beneath his anger. I built this life for us, he said, his voice softer now. Everything I did, everything. I did it for you. Jessica laughed bitterly. For me, you humiliated me, manipulated me, used everything I had to prop up your empire. That wasn't for me, Anthony. That was for you. Anthony took a step closer, his voice lowering to a near plea. You're my wife, Jessica. We're supposed to stand together, no matter what. You can't just throw that away. Jessica held her ground, her eyes steady. You already threw it away, Anthony. The moment you decided your ambition was more important than your integrity, more important than us. For a moment, Anthony said nothing, his jaw tightening as he processed her words. Finally, he stepped back, his expression hardening once more. You're making a mistake, he said coldly. And when this all blows over, don't expect me to save you. Jessica felt a pang of sadness at his words. Not because they hurt, but because they confirmed what she had known all along. Anthony Fletcher was a man who would never change. I don't need you to save me, Anthony, she said quietly. I'm saving myself. With that, she turned and walked back toward Frank, leaving Anthony standing alone in the shadows. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Jessica felt like she was finally walking in the right direction. The following morning, the first cracks in Anthony Fletcher's empire began to appear. News of the dramatic events at the Fletcher mansion had already spread, with headlines plastered across newspapers and online platforms. The fall of Anthony Fletcher, scandal rocks elite circles, read one. Exposé unravels lies behind a billionaire's success, declared another. Jessica sat in the breakfast nook of a small boutique hotel she had checked into the night before, sipping coffee and staring at her phone. The fallout was far swifter than she had anticipated. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, messages from friends, acquaintances, and even strangers who had witnessed the events of the previous night. Some offered words of support, while others merely sought gossip or clarification. Jessica ignored most of them, instead scrolling through the endless stream of articles detailing Anthony's downfall. Each story seemed to chip away at the image of the untouchable mogul Anthony had carefully crafted over decades. Reporters were already digging into Frank Collins' claims, and it wasn't long before others came forward to corroborate his accusations. Former employees, business partners, and contractors began sharing their own accounts of Anthony's exploitation, fraud, and manipulation. Jessica could almost hear the empire groaning under the weight of it all, teetering on the brink of collapse. Frank joined her at the table, a cup of coffee in hand. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed from the long night they had both endured. It's starting, he said, setting down his cup. The walls are coming down. Jessica nodded, her voice soft. I didn't think it would happen this quickly. Frank offered a small, grim smile. The thing about men like Anthony is they build their power on a foundation of lies, and once someone digs into it, the whole structure collapses faster than you'd think. Jessica set her phone down, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. What happens to him now? Frank leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. He'll try to fight it, of course. He'll call his lawyers, threaten lawsuits, claim everything is a smear campaign. But the evidence is there, Jessica. And now that it's public, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. Jessica wasn't sure how to feel about that. Part of her felt vindicated, knowing that Anthony was finally being held accountable for his actions. But another part of her, a quieter, more conflicted part, felt a twinge of sadness. She had spent so many years by his side, believing in the version of him he had presented to her. Letting go of that belief entirely felt like mourning a life she had never truly lived. Are you okay? Frank asked, breaking through her thoughts. She looked up at him, offering a faint smile. I think so, it's just a lot to process. Frank nodded. Understanding. It's not easy walking away from someone you've invested so much of your life in, but you did the right thing, Jessica, and not just for yourself, for everyone he's hurt. Jessica sighed, her gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to the personal turmoil she was navigating. "I know," she said quietly, "but it doesn't make it any less painful." Meanwhile, at Anthony's downtown office, the atmosphere was tense. His team of attorneys and PR specialists had gathered in the sleek conference room, their voices overlapping as they discussed damage control strategies. Anthony sat at the head of the table, his expression stony as he listened to their suggestions. "We need to release a statement immediately," one of the PR reps insisted. "Something that frames last night as a misunderstanding, maybe even discrediting Frank Collins." "Discrediting him won't work," one of the attorneys countered. "The documents he presented are already being analyzed by journalists. And if even half of them hold up under scrutiny, we're looking at potential lawsuits. Or worse, criminal charges." Anthony's jaw tightened. "I pay you to fix problems, not list them," he snapped. "Find a way to bury this before it spirals out of control." The room fell silent for a moment before another PR consultant hesitantly spoke up. "We could try leaning into sympathy, position you as a family man who's being targeted because of his success. Maybe even show reconciliation with Mrs. Fletcher." "Jessica," Anthony interrupted, his tone incredulous. "She's the reason this is happening. Do you think she's going to stand next to me and play happy family after what she pulled last night?" The consultant shifted uncomfortably. "It's just a suggestion, Mr. Fletcher." Anthony exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. He felt the walls closing in, the pressure mounting. For the first time in years, he didn't have a clear path forward. His usual tactics, bullying, charm, intimidation, seemed woefully inadequate in the face of this growing storm. "Leave," he said abruptly, his voice low but commanding. "All of you, I need time to think." The team exchanged uneasy glances but complied, gathering their notes and laptops before filing out of the room. Anthony remained seated, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city skyline. It had always been his domain, a symbol of his power and control. But now, it felt distant, almost mocking. His phone buzzed on the table, and he picked it up, half expecting another wave of messages from reporters or colleagues. Instead, it was a message from one of his closest confidants, a man who had always been loyal, until now. "We need to talk. People are distancing themselves. Don't expect me to stick around if this gets worse." Anthony's grip tightened on the phone, his knuckles turning white. Even his closest allies were abandoning him. The cracks in his empire were no longer just cracks. They were gaping fissures, threatening to swallow everything he had built. For the first time in decades, Anthony Fletcher felt something unfamiliar. Fear. Back at the boutique hotel, Jessica and Frank sat in companionable silence, their coffee cups empty, but forgotten. Jessica's phone buzzed again, and this time she hesitated before picking it up. The message was from a former colleague of Anthony's, a woman Jessica barely knew but recognized from past business events. "Thank you for standing up to him. You've given people like me a chance to speak out." Jessica stared at the message for a long moment, her chest tightening. The weight of what she had done, and what it meant for others, was finally starting to sink in. "You okay?" Frank asked, noticing her expression. Jessica looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I think I'm starting to be." The next morning, Jessica awoke to the sound of her phone vibrating insistently on the nightstand. She groaned, the weight of the previous night still heavy on her shoulders. She reached for the phone, her eyes barely open, and saw an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. Hesitating for a moment, she answered. "Hello?" A crisp, professional voice responded. "Mrs. Fletcher, my name is Margaret Hale. I'm an attorney who represents several individuals impacted by your husband's business dealings. I'd like to meet with you." Jessica sat up, her pulse quickening. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand why you'd want to meet with me." Margaret's tone softened slightly, though it remained firm. "I understand this is a difficult time for you, but your voice has become pivotal in this situation. Last night's events have already sparked inquiries, and your testimony could be instrumental in holding Anthony accountable. We'd like to discuss your perspective, off the record for now." Jessica's stomach tightened. She wasn't sure she was ready to get involved in a legal battle, but deep down, she knew she couldn't walk away now. "All right," she said quietly. When and where? Margaret arranged a meeting for later that afternoon, and as Jessica hung up, she felt a mixture of nerves and resolve. She dressed simply, her mind racing as she prepared herself for whatever this meeting would bring. By the time Jessica arrived at the sleek downtown office building Margaret had directed her to, she was running on adrenaline. The reception area was pristine, with modern furniture and abstract art adorning the walls. A young assistant greeted her and led her into a private conference room, where Margaret, a sharp-looking woman in her mid-40s, stood waiting. Margaret extended her hand, her grip firm. "Mrs. Fletcher, thank you for coming." "Jessica," she corrected gently. "Please, just call me Jessica." Margaret nodded with a small smile. "Jessica, then. I appreciate you meeting with me on such short notice." She gestured toward a chair. "Please, have a seat." Jessica sat down, folding her hands in her lap as Margaret opened a sleek leather portfolio. "I want to start by saying that I'm not here to pressure you into anything. You've already been through a lot, and I imagine the last thing you want is to be dragged into a legal circus. That said, your voice could make a significant difference in the fight for accountability." Jessica frowned slightly. "What do you mean by accountability? Isn't the evidence Frank Collins provided enough?" Margaret leaned forward, her expression serious. "The documents Frank presented are compelling, but they're only part of the puzzle. To build a solid case, we need corroboration. Details, context, anything that supports the claims. You were by Anthony's side for years, Jessica. You might know things without even realizing their importance." Jessica's mind raced as she considered Margaret's words. She thought back to the countless business dinners, the late-night phone calls, the guarded conversations Anthony had with his inner circle. At the time, she had dismissed much of it as part of the high-stakes world he operated in. But now, in hindsight, she wondered how much of it had been part of something darker. "I don't know," Jessica said hesitantly. "I'm not sure how much I can really help." Margaret placed a hand on the table, her expression gentle but firm. "Even the smallest detail can make a difference, and more importantly, your willingness to stand up and speak out sends a powerful message. People are watching, Jessica. Your courage could inspire others to come forward." Jessica swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She had spent so long living in Anthony's shadow, playing the role of the supportive wife, that the idea of stepping into the spotlight was both terrifying and exhilarating. Could she really do this? Could she really stand up to the man who had controlled her life for so long before she could answer? There was a knock at the door. The assistant stepped in, a hint of urgency in her voice. "Ms. Hale, you have another visitor. He says he's here to see Mrs. Fletcher." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Did he give a name?" The assistant nodded. "He said his name is Daniel Reed." Jessica's eyes widened. She hadn't heard that name in years, but she recognized it instantly. Daniel had been one of Anthony's closest confidants in the early days of his business ventures, a loyal partner who had mysteriously fallen out of Anthony's favor years ago. His sudden reappearance now sent a ripple of unease through her. Margaret studied Jessica's reaction. "Do you want to speak with him?" Jessica hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I think I need to." A moment later, Daniel entered the room. He looked older than Jessica remembered, with silver streaks in his dark hair and lines etched into his face. But his presence was as commanding as ever. He offered her a small, rueful smile. "Jessica," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's been a long time." "Daniel," she replied, her tone cautious. "What are you doing here?" He glanced at Margaret, then back at Jessica. "I heard about what happened last night, and I thought it was time I came forward. There are things you need to know about Anthony, about what really happened to me, and about the lengths he's willing to go to protect himself." Jessica's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Daniel took a deep breath, his expression somber. "Anthony didn't just cut me out of the business, Jessica. He destroyed me. He falsified documents, accused me of embezzlement, and ruined my reputation. I lost everything because I dared to question him, and I stayed silent because I thought it was the only way to protect my family." Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. She had always wondered why Daniel had disappeared so suddenly, but Anthony had dismissed it as a business disagreement. Now, hearing the truth, she felt a pang of guilt for not questioning it sooner. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Daniel, are you willing to testify, to provide evidence of what Anthony did to you?" Daniel nodded slowly. "I kept records, emails, contracts, everything I could salvage. I never thought I'd use them, but after last night, I realized it's time. Anthony needs to face the consequences of what he's done. Jessica looked between Daniel and Margaret, her heart pounding. The pieces were falling into place. But the picture they painted was darker and more complicated than she had imagined. And now, she realized, she wasn't just a bystander in this story. She was a key player in the fight to expose Anthony for who he truly was. Jessica left Margaret's office feeling a mix of apprehension and determination. The revelations from Daniel Reed had struck a chord deep within her, peeling back yet another layer of Anthony's deception. His actions, his lies. They had not only destroyed lives, but had also fed an empire built on exploitation and fear. For years, she had unknowingly supported that empire. But now, she was determined to dismantle it, brick by brick. As she walked through the busy streets of downtown, the crisp air sharpened her focus. She no longer felt like the timid woman who had quietly stood by Anthony's side. Instead, she felt a flicker of power growing within her, a sense of purpose that was unfamiliar yet exhilarating. It was time to take control. Her first stop was the boutique hotel where she'd been staying since leaving the mansion. She needed a moment to gather her thoughts and strategize her next move. Sitting on the edge of the neatly made bed, Jessica opened her laptop and began sifting through years of emails and documents she'd kept. Most of it was mundane correspondence, party invitations, charity event details. But every so often, she came across something that caught her attention. There were vague mentions of business deals she hadn't understood at the time, contracts Anthony had insisted she sign without explanation. One email in particular made her pause. It was a forwarded message from Anthony's attorney, referencing a property transfer she had authorized. Jessica's heart raced as she realized the implications. Had Anthony used her name to hide assets? Was she unknowingly complicit in his schemes? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Jessica's pulse quickened as she stood, unsure of who it could be. She peered through the peephole and saw Frank standing on the other side. His expression a mix of concern and urgency. She opened the door. "Frank, what are you doing here?" Frank stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I just got a call from Margaret. She said Daniel Reed came forward." Jessica nodded, gesturing for him to sit. He did, and what he said, it was worse than I imagined. "Frank, Anthony didn't just cut him out of the business. He ruined his life." Frank leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "That doesn't surprise me. Anthony's always been ruthless, Jessica. But now that Daniel's involved, we have a real shot at taking him down. Daniel's evidence, combined with what we've already uncovered, could be enough to launch a full-scale investigation." Jessica hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Frank, there's something I need to tell you. I've been going through old emails and documents, and I think Anthony used my name to hide assets. I don't know the full extent yet, but if that's true, it could complicate things." Frank's expression darkened. "If he did, it's not just unethical, it's criminal. But it also puts you in a dangerous position. If those assets are tied to fraudulent activity, you could be implicated." Jessica's stomach sank. She had always trusted Anthony when it came to financial matters, signing documents without question because she believed he had their best interests at heart. Now that blind trust could come back to haunt her. Frank reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Listen to me. If Anthony used your name without your full knowledge, that's on him, not you. But we need to act quickly. The more we uncover, the better prepared we'll be to protect you and hold him accountable." Jessica nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then let's do it. I won't let him drag me down with him." By the afternoon, Jessica and Frank were back at Margaret's office, joined by Daniel Reed and a small team of legal experts. The atmosphere was tense but focused, the room filled with the rustling of papers and the clicking of keyboards as they pieced together the puzzle of Anthony's corruption. Daniel laid out the evidence he had kept hidden for years: contracts with forged signatures, emails detailing fraudulent transactions, and even recordings of conversations he'd secretly taped during his final months working with Anthony. Each piece painted a damning picture of a man who had stopped at nothing to protect his empire. Margaret turned to Jessica. "Have you found anything in your own records that could support this?" Jessica hesitated, then opened her laptop and pulled up the email she had flagged earlier. It's an email from Anthony's attorney about a property transfer. I don't remember the details, but he had me sign something around the same time. I didn't question it then, but now." Margaret studied the email, her brow furrowing. If this transfer involved fraudulent funds, it could be a key piece of evidence. We'll need to trace the transaction and determine where the money came from. Frank leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. And if it ties back to Anthony, it could open the floodgates. Jessica felt a wave of anxiety but pushed it down. She couldn't afford to falter now. What do we do next? Margaret looked around the room, her expression firm. We build our case. Every document, every email, every piece of evidence. Catalog it, connect it, and prepare for the inevitable pushback. Anthony's lawyers will come after us with everything they have. But if we're thorough, they won't stand a chance. Daniel nodded, his voice resolute. I'll testify, whatever it takes. Jessica glanced at him, her gratitude evident. Thank you, Daniel. I know this isn't easy. He offered a small, weary smile. It's not just about me anymore, Jessica. It's about everyone he's hurt. People like you, Frank. Even the workers who never had a voice. It's time Anthony faced the consequences. As the team continued to strategize, Jessica felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time, she wasn't just reacting to Anthony's actions. She was taking control of her own narrative. The path ahead was daunting, but she knew she wasn't walking it alone. By the time the meeting concluded, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. Jessica stepped outside with Frank and Daniel, the weight of the day settling over her. This is just the beginning, Frank said quietly. Jessica nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. I know, but I'm ready. And for the first time, she truly believed it. Anthony Fletcher wasn't a man who sat idle while his world crumbled. From the moment the news of the scandal broke, he had retreated to his private office, a fortress of leather-bound books, towering windows, and the scent of cigar smoke that clung to the air. His desk was cluttered with papers and 2 phones, one buzzing incessantly with calls and messages he ignored, and the other reserved for direct communication with his inner circle. On this particular morning, Anthony was seated at his desk, his posture tense, his jaw set like a predator ready to pounce. His attorney, a sharp-suited man named Victor Malone, sat across from him, briefing him on the fallout. Anthony, Victor began, his voice steady. We're facing a multi-pronged attack. Frank Collins's claims are gaining traction, and with Daniel Reed stepping forward, they're starting to piece together a narrative that paints you as the villain. Anthony scoffed, leaning back in his chair. Of course they are. That's the game, Victor. But they don't have the full picture. They think they're smarter than me, but they don't know how this game is played. Victor adjusted his tie, carefully choosing his words. The issue isn't just the accusations. It's the fact that Jessica is standing against you. Her voice adds legitimacy to their claims, and frankly, it's swaying public opinion. The media is eating it up. At the mention of Jessica, Anthony's expression darkened. He leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. Jessica has no idea what she's doing. She thinks she's some kind of martyr now. But she doesn't realize she's dragging herself down with me. Victor hesitated. Actually, Anthony, if Jessica continues to cooperate with the investigation, it could shield her from any legal fallout. She's already distancing herself from you, and if she proves she wasn't complicit, Anthony slammed his fist on the desk, cutting Victor off. She was complicit, he barked. Everything I built, everything I did, it was for her. She signed the papers, she played the part, and now she wants to act like a saint. No, I won't let her walk away from this unscathed. Victor's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. So what's the plan? Because right now we're playing defense and it's not working. Anthony's lips curved into a cold, calculating smile. We go on the offensive. If Jessica wants a war, I'll give her one. I know her weaknesses, Victor. She may have found her voice, but I can silence it just as quickly. Victor arched an eyebrow. Are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, Anthony interrupted, his tone icy, that we remind her who she's dealing with, dig into her past, find anything we can use against her, and if we can't find anything, we make something up. Victor's unease was evident, but he nodded. I'll see what I can do. But Anthony, you need to tread carefully. If this backfires, it won't backfire, Anthony snapped, because I don't lose, Victor. Not to Frank, not to Daniel, and certainly not to Jessica. Victor stood gathering his briefcase. I'll get started immediately. As Victor left the room, Anthony leaned back in his chair. Staring out the window at the sprawling city skyline, he had always been a man who thrived under pressure, who turned chaos into opportunity. And while his empire was under siege, He wasn't about to let it crumble without a fight. That same afternoon, Jessica was sitting in the living room of her small hotel suite, reviewing documents Margaret had sent over. Frank and Daniel had been instrumental in helping her piece together the puzzle of Anthony's schemes, but the deeper they dug, the more complicated the web became. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She picked it up and saw a text from Margaret. "Be cautious, E. We've heard rumblings that Anthony may be planning to discredit you. Call me if you need anything." Jessica's stomach turned. She had expected Anthony to retaliate. He wasn't the type to back down, but seeing it in writing made it feel more real, more immediate. She set the phone down and took a deep breath. Trying to steady herself, she wouldn't let him intimidate her. Not anymore. Moments later, there was a knock at her door. Jessica stood, her pulse quickening as she peered through the peephole. To her relief, it was Frank. She opened the door, and he stepped inside, a folder in his hand and a concerned look on his face. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. Jessica gestured for him to sit. "What's going on?" Frank set the folder on the coffee table and opened it, revealing a series of printed emails and social media posts. "Anthony's team is moving fast. They're trying to spin a narrative that you were fully aware of his actions and even benefited from them." Jessica frowned, leaning closer to examine the documents. "That's not true. I had no idea what he was doing behind the scenes." Frank nodded. "I believe you, but they're already planting seeds of doubt in the media. Look at this." He pointed to a printed article with the headline, "Jessica Fletcher, a beneficiary or a victim." Jessica's hands tightened into fists. "He's trying to make me look like an accomplice." "Exactly," Frank said. "He knows your credibility is a threat to him, so he's doing everything he can to undermine it. But here's the thing. His desperation makes him sloppy. We can use this against him." Jessica looked up at Frank, her determination hardening. "What do we do?" Frank leaned forward, his voice steady and reassuring. "We stay ahead of him. We keep building our case, and we make sure your story is consistent and backed by evidence. The more transparent you are, the harder it'll be for him to discredit you." Jessica nodded, her resolve unwavering. "I'm not backing down, Frank. Not now. Not ever." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Anthony sat in his office, scrolling through the articles and social media posts his team had orchestrated. He smirked, satisfied that the seeds of doubt were beginning to take root. But what Anthony didn't realize was that his desperation was fueling Jessica's determination. With Frank, Daniel, and Margaret by her side, she was no longer the silent, submissive wife he had controlled for years. She was a woman reclaiming her power, and she wasn't going to stop until the truth came to light. And while Anthony plotted his counterattack, Jessica was preparing for the next battle. This wasn't just about exposing his lies. It was about ensuring that he could never hurt anyone else again. The following morning, Jessica woke early, her mind buzzing with thoughts of the challenges ahead. The previous evening's conversation with Frank had ignited a fire in her, but the mounting pressure weighed heavily on her shoulders. Anthony's attempt to paint her as an accomplice was predictable, but it still stung. She knew this battle wasn't just about exposing Anthony's lies. It was about reclaiming her own identity. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a text from Margaret. "Press conference scheduled for noon. Be ready to speak. You've got this." Jessica took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the phone. Margaret and her team had decided it was time to take control of the narrative. By going public, Jessica could counter Anthony's smear campaign and show the world the truth, but standing in front of cameras, baring her soul to strangers, felt like an insurmountable task. As she got dressed, she reminded herself why she was doing this. For the years of silence, for the people Anthony had hurt, for herself. By noon, Jessica found herself standing behind a podium in a modest conference room filled with reporters. The room buzzed with the hum of conversations, the clicks of cameras, and the occasional murmur as journalists reviewed their notes. Margaret stood beside her, offering a reassuring smile, while Frank and Daniel sat in the front row, their presence a silent but powerful show of support. Jessica's heart pounded as she adjusted the microphone. The bright lights of the cameras bore down on her, making the room feel both hot and cold at the same time. She glanced at Margaret, who gave her a subtle nod, urging her to begin. Jessica cleared her throat, her voice steady despite the nerves coursing through her. "Good afternoon," she began, her eyes scanning the room. "My name is Jessica Fletcher, and for years, I've been known as the wife of Anthony Fletcher. But today, I stand before you not as his wife, but as a woman who has found her voice." The room fell silent, the hum of conversations fading as the reporters leaned in, their pens poised. For more than a decade, I stood by Anthony's side, believing in the image he presented to the world. I believed he was a man of integrity, a man building something meaningful. But the events of the past few days have revealed a truth I can no longer ignore. She paused, her voice steadying further. Anthony Fletcher built his empire on lies, manipulation, and exploitation. And while I didn't know the full extent of his actions at the time, I realize now that my silence made me complicit. I signed documents I didn't fully understand. I ignored the red flags, and I allowed myself to believe that loyalty meant turning a blind eye. Jessica's voice grew stronger, her conviction shining through. "But I am done being silent. I am done being complicit. Last night, I began to speak out, and today, I continue to do so, not just for myself, but for everyone Anthony has hurt. The workers who lost their livelihoods, the partners who were betrayed, the people who believed in him, only to be left with nothing." Cameras flashed, capturing every word, every emotion etched on her face. Jessica felt the weight of the room shift, the skepticism giving way to respect. "I want to make something clear," she continued. "I am cooperating fully with the investigation into Anthony's actions. I have provided and will continue to provide any evidence I have to ensure that justice is served. This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability. It's about making sure no one else suffers the way so many already have." A hand shot up in the audience, a reporter eager to interject. Jessica nodded toward him, granting him the floor. "Mrs. Fletcher," he began, his tone respectful, "Anthony Fletcher's team has suggested that you benefited from his actions and that you're only speaking out now to protect yourself. How do you respond to that?" Jessica met his gaze head on, her voice unwavering. "Anthony's team is doing what they've always done, twisting the narrative to serve their own agenda. Did I benefit from Anthony's success? On the surface, yes, I lived in his mansion, attended his parties, and wore the clothes he bought. But what I've learned is that those benefits came at a cost I didn't realize I was paying until it was too late. The cost was my dignity, my identity, and my ability to see the truth. I'm speaking out now because it's the right thing to do, not because it's easy." The room buzzed with approval, the respect for her growing with each word. Another reporter raised her hand. "Jessica, do you fear retaliation from Anthony or his team?" Jessica hesitated for only a moment before responding. "I know Anthony. I know how he operates, and I'm not naive to the fact that he will try to silence me. But I won't back down. I won't be intimidated. The truth is on my side, and I believe that will prevail." Frank and Daniel exchanged a glance, their pride in Jessica evident. She was no longer the woman they had met just days ago. Unsure of her place in this battle, she was a force to be reckoned with. Jessica finished her statement with a final, resolute declaration. "To anyone who has ever felt powerless, silenced, or trapped, I want you to know that it's never too late to find your voice. It's never too late to stand up for what's right. And together, we can ensure that people like Anthony Fletcher are held accountable for their actions." The room erupted into applause, an unusual but heartfelt response from the typically detached press. Jessica stepped back from the podium, her heart racing, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from a sense of triumph. As the press conference concluded and the reporters began filing out, Margaret approached Jessica, her face lit with pride. "You were incredible," she said. "That was exactly what we needed to counter Anthony's narrative." Jessica nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "It wasn't easy, but it felt right, like I'm finally doing something that matters." Frank and Daniel joined them, both of them beaming. "You've turned the tide, Jessica," Frank said. "Now it's Anthony who's on the defensive." Jessica exhaled, the weight of the day settling over her. "It's not over yet, but I'm ready for whatever comes next." That evening, as Jessica sat in her hotel room, the news played on the small TV in the corner. Clips from her press conference dominated the headlines, accompanied by analysis from pundits and commentators. The narrative was shifting, and for the first time, Anthony Fletcher wasn't in control of the story. Jessica watched, a quiet determination settling over her. She had found her voice, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it away again. Jessica sat on the edge of her bed that morning, the glow of the television reflecting on her face. The news coverage of her press conference had not only dominated the airwaves, but had also begun to spark broader conversations about accountability in the business world. Analysts debated the ethics of Anthony's empire, workers shared stories of their mistreatment, and journalists dug deeper into the allegations against him. It wasn't just about Anthony anymore. It was about the system he represented, and Jessica, once dismissed as his quiet, subservient wife, was now becoming a symbol of courage and resilience. Her phone buzzed with a call. The name on the screen made her pause. "Margaret Hale," she answered quickly. "Margaret, we've got him," Margaret said, her voice filled with urgency. Jessica's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "Anthony's lawyers have been trying to negotiate behind the scenes, but something broke this morning. A former accountant who worked closely with him during some of his most questionable deals has agreed to testify, and the documents Daniel provided match perfectly with her records. It's a slam dunk." Jessica felt her heart leap, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over her. "So, what happens now?" Margaret's voice softened. "The authorities are preparing to issue a formal subpoena, and it's likely Anthony will be facing charges. They're building a case for fraud, embezzlement, and several other financial crimes. This could be the beginning of the end for him." Jessica exhaled, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on her. "I knew this would happen, but hearing it out loud, it's surreal." "You've been incredible, Jessica," Margaret said. "You've stood your ground when it would have been easier to back down. You should be proud." Jessica managed a small smile. "Thank you, Margaret. I just want to make sure no one else gets hurt." Meanwhile, Anthony sat in his now eerily quiet office. The once busy space, usually buzzing with activity, had become a graveyard. Calls had stopped coming, emails had gone unanswered, and the team that once surrounded him with loyalty had all but vanished. Even Victor Malone, his longtime attorney, had grown distant. Anthony stared at the glass of whiskey in his hand, the amber liquid swirling as his mind raced. The walls were closing in, and for the first time, he felt truly powerless. His empire, his legacy, was unraveling faster than he could contain it. His phone rang, breaking the heavy silence. He glanced at the screen. "Victor," he answered with a sharp, "What?" Victor's voice was clipped, devoid of its usual confidence. "Anthony, we need to talk, immediately." Anthony leaned back in his chair, his grip tightening on the phone. "About. The authorities are moving quickly. There's a subpoena coming your way, and the press is all over it. If you don't take control of the situation now, you're going to lose everything." Anthony's jaw clenched. "And what do you propose I do, Victor? Roll over and let them take me down?" Victor sighed. "You need to negotiate. Offer something in exchange for leniency if you cooperate." "Cooperate!" Anthony barked, slamming his glass onto the desk. "Do you know who you're talking to? I don't cooperate. I fight." Victor hesitated, his tone growing colder. "This isn't a fight you can win, Anthony. The evidence is overwhelming, and Jessica's public statements have turned the tide against you. She's not just your wife anymore. She's the face of your opposition." Anthony's grip tightened on the phone. "Jessica thinks she's won, but she has no idea what I'm capable of." Victor's voice dropped. "If you go after her now, it will only make things worse for you. Take my advice, Anthony. Step back, cooperate, and salvage what little you have left." Anthony ended the call without another word, his jaw set as he stared out the window. He wasn't ready to give up, not yet. Later that day, Jessica arrived at Margaret's office for another meeting. Frank and Daniel were already there, their faces lit with cautious optimism. "We've got momentum," Frank said as she entered. "The media's on our side, the legal case is solidifying, and now, with the accountant's testimony, Anthony's in a corner." Jessica took a seat, her hands folded in her lap. "What's our next move?" Margaret adjusted her glasses, spreading a stack of papers across the table. "We continue to build the case. Every detail counts. Jessica, your willingness to speak publicly has been crucial. But now we need to prepare for the courtroom." Jessica nodded, though the thought of standing before a judge and jury filled her with anxiety. "I'll do whatever it takes. I just want this to be over." "It will be," Margaret assured her. "But we have to stay vigilant. Anthony won't go down without a fight." As they discussed the next steps, Jessica felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in years, she wasn't just reacting to Anthony's actions. She was taking charge of her own story. That evening, as Jessica returned to her hotel, she received an unexpected visitor. The concierge called up to her room, informing her that someone was waiting in the lobby. When she descended the stairs, she was met with the sight of a woman in her late 40s, dressed in a sharp but modest suit. "Mrs. Fletcher," the woman asked, extending a hand. "I'm Evelyn Harper. I worked for your husband years ago as his accountant." Jessica's eyes widened. "You're the one who agreed to testify?" Evelyn nodded, her expression serious. "I wanted to speak with you directly. I know what it's like to be in your position, to feel trapped in Anthony's world, and I want you to know that you're not alone in this fight." Jessica felt a lump rise in her throat. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Evelyn hesitated, then added, "There's something else you should know, Anthony. He's not just trying to protect his empire. He's trying to protect himself. There are things he's done, things beyond financial fraud, that he'll do anything to keep hidden." Jessica's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Evelyn glanced around the lobby, lowering her voice. "There are people who know too much, people he's silenced before. Be careful, Jessica. He's desperate, and desperate men are dangerous." Jessica's heart pounded as Evelyn's words sank in. She had known Anthony was ruthless, but this was something else entirely. As Evelyn left, Jessica felt a chill settle over her. This wasn't just about exposing Anthony's lies anymore. It was about survival. Jessica barely slept that night. Evelyn's warning replayed in her mind on an endless loop. She had always known Anthony was capable of manipulation, cruelty, and deceit, but the thought that he might go to even darker lengths to protect himself sent chills down her spine. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she stared at the city lights outside her hotel window, her thoughts racing. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was fighting to protect herself and everyone who stood against Anthony. The next morning, as Jessica prepared to meet with Margaret and her team, her phone buzzed with an incoming text. It was from an unknown number. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Walk away before it's too late." Her breath hitched and her hands trembled as she stared at the message. It didn't explicitly name Anthony, but she knew it had to be connected to him. This wasn't the first time she'd felt his shadow looming over her, but this was different. It felt more direct, more sinister. Jessica quickly forwarded the text to Margaret and called her immediately. "Jessica, are you okay?" Margaret asked, concern evident in her voice. "I just got a message," Jessica said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's a threat. Someone wants me to back off." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Margaret's tone turned resolute. "Jessica, this is serious. I'll notify the authorities and make sure you have additional security. Do not go anywhere alone and keep your phone on you at all times." "We're not taking any chances." Jessica nodded, though Margaret couldn't see her. "Thank you. I'll be careful." As she hung up, Jessica felt a wave of fear, but also a surge of determination. She wasn't going to let Anthony or his threats intimidate her. She had come too far to back down now. Later that day, Jessica arrived at Margaret's office under the watchful eye of a hired security guard. Frank and Daniel were already there, their faces clouded with worry when she walked in. Margaret wasted no time. She held up a copy of the text message Jessica had forwarded to her. "This changes things," she said firmly. "We've notified the authorities and they're treating this as a credible threat, Jessica. This isn't just about protecting your reputation anymore. It's about your safety." Frank clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He's desperate. He knows he's losing control. Daniel nodded. "This is exactly the kind of move Anthony would make. He's trying to scare you into submission. Don't let him." Jessica sat down, her expression calm but resolute. "I'm not scared," she said, though the truth was more complicated. She was scared, but she wouldn't let that fear dictate her actions. "We keep going, whatever it takes." Margaret placed a hand on Jessica's shoulder, her voice softening. "You're incredibly brave, Jessica. But remember, you don't have to do this alone. We're with you every step of the way." Jessica offered a faint smile, grateful for their support. "I know, and that's why I'm not giving up." Meanwhile, Anthony was pacing his office, barking orders into his phone. His once pristine empire was collapsing around him, and every attempt to contain the damage seemed to fail. The press had turned against him. Former allies were abandoning him, and now even his legal team seemed hesitant to fight the mounting allegations. "Fix it," Anthony snarled into the phone. "I don't care what it takes. Just make this go away." The voice on the other end was measured but firm. Anthony, there's only so much we can do. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and Jessica's public statements have solidified her credibility. If you continue down this path, you risk making things worse for yourself. Anthony slammed the phone onto his desk, his frustration boiling over. He couldn't understand how everything had unraveled so quickly. For years, he had controlled every aspect of his life with precision, manipulating people and situations to his advantage. But now, it seemed as though the entire world was conspiring against him as he poured himself a drink. Anthony's mind wandered to Jessica. She had been his greatest asset, his perfect facade of respectability. He had never imagined she would turn against him, let alone become the key figure in his downfall. She thinks she's won, he muttered to himself, his voice low and venomous. But this isn't over. Back at the office, Margaret's team was making progress. The evidence against Anthony was piling up, and the authorities were moving closer to issuing formal charges. Jessica worked tirelessly alongside them, reviewing documents and providing any information she could remember from her years with Anthony. As the hours passed, Jessica received another message, this time from a number she recognized. It was Anthony. "Jessica, we need to talk. You don't know the full story. Let me explain before you ruin everything." Jessica's stomach turned. The audacity of his message made her blood boil. She immediately showed it to Margaret. Margaret frowned, her brow furrowing. "He's trying to manipulate you, Jessica. Don't respond." "I wasn't planning to," Jessica said, her voice firm. "But this proves he's feeling the pressure. He's trying to find a way out." Frank chimed in. "We're close, Jessica. Don't let him rattle you. He's running out of moves." Jessica nodded, her resolve strengthening. She wouldn't let Anthony drag her back into his web of lies and manipulation. As night fell, Jessica returned to her hotel, her body weary but her mind still racing. She double-checked the locks on her door and glanced out the window, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. Evelyn's warning echoed in her mind. Desperate men are dangerous. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone. Part of her wanted to call Anthony, to confront him, to demand answers to the countless questions that still lingered. But she knew better. Anthony didn't deserve her time, her energy, or her forgiveness. Instead, she opened her laptop and began drafting a statement for the authorities, detailing everything she could remember about Anthony's actions. Every detail mattered, and she was determined to do her part to bring him to justice. As she typed, Jessica felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about exposing Anthony. It was about reclaiming her own power, her own story, and for the first time, she felt truly in control. Across the city, Anthony sat alone in his office, the weight of his crumbling empire pressing down on him. He stared at his phone, debating whether to send another message to Jessica. But deep down, he knew it was futile. She wasn't the woman he had controlled for years. She was something far stronger, far more dangerous to him, and for the first time, Anthony Fletcher felt truly afraid. The morning light filtered through the windows of Jessica's hotel room, bringing with it the promise of another day, one that could prove pivotal in the battle against Anthony. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting her from a light, restless sleep. It was Margaret again, her message short and to the point. "Anthony has been subpoenaed. The case is moving forward. Meet me at the office." Jessica took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she read the words. This was it, the turning point. She quickly dressed, her mind racing as she prepared for the meeting. The reality of Anthony finally being held accountable was exhilarating, but it also brought with it a sense of trepidation. She knew this victory would not come without a fight. At Margaret's office, the atmosphere was electric. The legal team buzzed with activity, poring over documents and strategizing the next steps. Frank and Daniel were already there when Jessica arrived, their expressions a mix of relief and determination. "Jessica," Frank greeted her, standing to pull out a chair for her. "You're just in time. Things are moving fast." Margaret entered the room, her stride purposeful, as she placed a stack of papers on the table. "Anthony has been officially subpoenaed," she announced. "The charges are extensive: fraud, embezzlement, and financial misconduct, among others. This is the culmination of everything we've worked for." Jessica sat down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "What happens next?" Margaret's expression was serious. "Anthony will have to respond to the charges, but knowing him, he won't go quietly. He'll fight this with every resource he has left, which means we need to be prepared for a long and drawn-out battle. Frank chimed in, his tone confident. But the good news is we have the upper hand, the evidence is airtight, and public opinion has already turned against him. It's only a matter of time. Jessica nodded, though the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on her. I just want this to be over, she admitted quietly. I want to move on with my life. Margaret offered her a reassuring smile. And you will. But for now, we need to stay focused. This is the final stretch. Across town, Anthony sat in his once pristine office. The tension palpable, the subpoena lay on his desk, a stark reminder of how far he had fallen. His legal team, now reduced to a skeleton crew, scrambled to formulate a defense. But even they seemed to know it was a losing battle. Victor Malone entered the room, his face grim. Anthony, we need to talk. Anthony looked up, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. What now? Victor placed a file on the desk. We've been reviewing the evidence against you, and it's bad, really bad. If this goes to trial, you're looking at years in prison. Decades even. I need you to consider a plea deal. Anthony's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. A plea deal? You think I'm going to roll over and admit to something I didn't do? Victor's voice remained calm, though his frustration was evident. Anthony, we both know you did these things. The evidence is overwhelming. If you cooperate, you might be able to reduce your sentence. But if you keep fighting this, you're only digging yourself a deeper hole. Anthony stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. I built this empire, he growled. I'm not going to let them tear it down. Victor sighed, shaking his head. Your empire is already gone, Anthony. The only question now is how much more you're willing to lose. But Anthony wasn't listening. His mind raced with thoughts of revenge, of ways to turn the tide back in his favor. He wouldn't accept defeat. Later that day, Jessica found herself standing outside the courthouse, the weight of the moment settling over her. Margaret had insisted she attend the formal announcement of the charges against Anthony, not just to show solidarity, but to remind the world that she was no longer under his control. The press had gathered in droves, their cameras flashing as Jessica stepped into view. She kept her head high, her expression calm but resolute. Margaret stood by her side, her presence a steadying force. As the prosecutor read the list of charges against Anthony, Jessica felt a mix of emotions, relief, vindication, and even a twinge of sadness despite everything he had done. There was a part of her that mourned the man she had once loved, the man she had believed in before his greed and ambition consumed him. When the announcement concluded, Jessica stepped forward to address the press. She had prepared a statement, but as she stood before the cameras, she decided to speak from the heart. Today marks a turning point, she began, her voice steady. Not just for me, but for everyone who has been hurt by Anthony Fletcher's actions. For years, I was silent. I believed my loyalty to him meant turning a blind eye to the truth. But silence is complicity, and I refuse to be complicit any longer. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. This isn't just about one man's downfall. It's about holding people accountable, no matter how powerful they are. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, and it's about showing others that it's never too late to find your voice. The applause that followed was unexpected but heartfelt, and for the first time, Jessica felt truly free. Meanwhile, Anthony watched the press conference from his office, his expression dark. He turned off the television with a sharp flick of his wrist, his mind swirling with anger and desperation. Jessica's defiance stung more than any legal challenge. She had been his greatest asset, and now she was his most formidable opponent. As the sun set over the city, Anthony poured himself a drink, staring out the window at the skyline that had once been his domain. The empire he had built was crumbling around him, and for the first time, he realized there was no one left to save him. The fall of Anthony Fletcher was inevitable, and he knew it. But in his heart, he still believed he could claw his way back. He just needed one last move, one final gambit to tip the scales in his favor. But as the lights of the city twinkled in the distance, Anthony couldn't shake the feeling that his time was running out. The day of Anthony's arraignment arrived, and the courthouse was abuzz with reporters, legal teams, and spectators eager to witness the next chapter of the scandal that had gripped the city. Jessica arrived early, flanked by Margaret and her security detail. The building felt cold, the sterile walls reflecting the enormity of what was about to unfold. Jessica took a seat in the courtroom, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The wooden benches were filled with reporters and members of the public, all craning their necks for a glimpse of Anthony Fletcher, the man whose name had become synonymous with greed and corruption. When Anthony entered, escorted by his lawyers, the room seemed to hold its breath. He was still dressed impeccably, his tailored suit pressed to perfection, but there was no hiding the tension in his face. His usual air of dominance was gone, replaced by a thin veneer of composure that threatened to crack under the weight of the charges against him. Anthony's eyes scanned the room until they landed on Jessica. For a brief moment, their gazes met. Jessica held his stare, her expression calm but resolute. She wouldn't look away. Not now. Not after everything. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent as the proceedings began. The charges were read aloud, each word hammering another nail into the coffin of Anthony's reputation. Fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, witness tampering. The list seemed endless, and with each charge, Jessica felt the weight of years of lies and betrayal being laid bare. Anthony's lawyer, Victor, stood to enter a plea. "Not guilty, Your Honor," a murmur rippled through the courtroom, but Jessica wasn't surprised. Anthony would never admit guilt. Not publicly, not privately. He was a man who would fight until his last breath, even if it meant dragging everyone else down with him. After the hearing, Jessica stepped outside into the cold air. The buzz of reporters and onlookers surrounding her, cameras flashed and questions were shouted, but she ignored them, keeping her focus on Margaret, who walked beside her. Margaret placed a hand on Jessica's arm. "You handled yourself well in there. This was just the beginning, but it's an important step." Jessica nodded, her mind racing. "Do you think he'll fight this all the way to trial?" Margaret sighed. "Knowing Anthony, yes, but we have the evidence, Jessica, and with the accountant, Daniel, and others willing to testify, his chances of winning are slim." Frank and Daniel joined them as they walked to the car waiting at the curb. Frank's face was a mix of relief and cautious optimism. "You did great in there, Jessica. And seeing him like that, he's unraveling," Daniel added. "The more he fights, the more desperate he'll become. We just have to stay one step ahead." Jessica felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, it seemed like the scales were tipping in their favor. But she knew the fight wasn't over yet. Anthony was a man who thrived on control, and he would do everything in his power to regain it. That night, Jessica sat alone in her hotel room, staring at the city lights outside her window. The day's events replayed in her mind. The charges, the courtroom, Anthony's gaze. She felt a mix of emotions, relief that the truth was finally coming to light, sadness for what she had lost, and fear of what was still to come. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from an unknown number. "Meet me. We need to talk. You'll want to hear what I have to say." "Anthony." Jessica's heart raced as she read the message. She knew she should ignore it, but a part of her was curious. What could Anthony possibly have to say now? After a moment of hesitation, she forwarded the message to Margaret, along with a quick note. "He wants to meet. What should I do?" Margaret's response came quickly. "Do not meet him alone. If you want to hear him out, we'll arrange a secure location with legal oversight." Jessica nodded to herself. Reassured by Margaret's guidance, she replied, "Let's set it up." 2 days later, the meeting was arranged in a neutral, secured office space with legal representatives present on both sides. Jessica arrived early, her nerves taut but her resolve strong. She sat in a plain conference room, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead the only sound. When Anthony entered, she was struck by how much he had changed in just a few weeks. His face was drawn, his confidence diminished, but there was still a glint of defiance in his eyes. He sat across from her, his hands resting on the table. "Jessica," he began, his voice low and controlled. "I'm not here to argue or fight. I just want to explain." Jessica tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Explain what, Anthony? How you built your empire on lies? How you manipulated me for years? Or how you're now trying to destroy me because I won't stay silent?" Anthony exhaled sharply, his composure cracking slightly. "I didn't bring you here to rehash old wounds. I brought you here because I need your help." Jessica blinked, taken aback. "My help," she repeated incredulous. "After everything you've done, You think I'd help you?" Anthony leaned forward, his tone desperate. "Jessica, I'm not the only one involved in this. There are people, powerful people, who stood beside me, who benefited from everything I did. If I go down, they won't just let it happen. They'll come after me." "And they'll come after you too." Jessica stared at him, her disbelief turning to anger. "Don't you dare try to drag me into this. I'm not the one who broke the law, Anthony. You are, and now you're trying to use me to save yourself." "I'm trying to protect you," Anthony snapped, his voice rising. "You don't understand what's at stake." Jessica shook her head, her voice cold. "No, Anthony, you don't understand. I'm done protecting you. I'm done being your pawn. Whatever happens next, you brought it on yourself." Anthony's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists. "You're making a mistake. Jessica, you think these people care about justice? They'll chew you up and spit you out." Jessica stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "Maybe they will, but at least I'll know I did the right thing. Can you say the same?" Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Anthony alone in the sterile, empty space. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, Jessica felt a strange sense of peace. The battle wasn't over, but she had faced Anthony one last time, and she hadn't wavered. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. The lights of the city sparkled around her, and Jessica allowed herself a small, hopeful smile. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where she was finally in control of her own story.